I never used to believe in God, not really. I never used to be a Christian. I didn't become a Christian until around my early mid-30s. I used to think that religious people based their faith on irrational, blind leaps, subjective emotional experiences, or maybe various childhood indoctrinations. And I was pretty sure that I knew better. Because I was, after all, a man that dealt professionally, as it were, with evidence, not blind faith. I got paid to gather and evaluate evidence. Firstly, as a policeman, and then after that, as a criminal defence lawyer. But then one day, whilst kind of channel hopping, I stumbled across a TV documentary made by Richard Dawkins, the British biologist and militant atheist. And the documentary was called The Root of All Evil. And he was, of course, referring to religion. The programme grabbed me, it shook me, because I realised that it actually mattered. It actually mattered to me whether Dawkins was right or not. It helped me to see that the question of whether God exists or not is actually of profound importance. And he made me realise, Dawkins made me realise that basically I had arrived at an answer to the most important issue that we humans ever deal with. Is there a God? And I'd arrived there without ever really looking at the evidence. And I was someone that actually looked at evidence for a living. Yet I'd never bothered to do that. I'd never bothered to do that when it came to the most profound questions of all. So I started a journey. It quickly dawned on me that as someone who'd spent their whole life working with evidence, in using evidence, examining evidence, I could do the same thing with God and with Jesus. I could investigate them. Now, when it comes to what's the best type of evidence, do you know what that is? Anybody want to shout out an offer? Very good. Close. There's even better evidence than that.
Experience.
Even better evidence than that.
Physical evidence?
Say again?
Physical?
All good stuff. The best is forensic evidence. Fingerprints and DNA. So when we look for evidence, and the best evidence for who Jesus was and is, in a sense, we are looking for his fingerprints and his DNA. Now, at services over this Christmas period, churches will have readings from both the Old and the New Testaments. And to many people, quite understandably, these readings can just seem like they're just part of a seasonal habit and chosen out of tradition. I want to encourage you this morning, put on your detective hats and look carefully at them afresh with me, just for the next few minutes. For I want to say that they are all a part of a body of evidence that I might call a case for Christ. Let's just first think about fingerprints. Fingerprinting as evidence didn't come about until 1910. And it came about pretty much by accident. There was a family of 4 named the Hillers, and they lived in Chicago, Illinois. And Mr. Hiller, the father, had just finished painting his house. But that night the family was burgled. And unfortunately for him, the thief came in through the kitchen window, left 3 fingerprints on the window ledge in fresh paint that Mr. Hiller had just applied to the house. The police had never used fingerprinting before as a form of evidence. But here they were, with evidence for the existence of a man, and now they just needed to find him. Fingerprint evidence was developed from that moment on. And as for DNA, well, in the year 2000, US President Bill Clinton and British Prime Minister Tony Blair, they held a joint press conference to make the world-changing announcement that the Human Genome Project, the project to discover the mysteries of human DNA, it had finally been completed. Now, with them that day was the man who had led this project. His name is Dr. Francis Collins. More on him shortly. But during his address, President Clinton said this: when Galileo discovered that he could use the tools of mathematics and mechanics to understand the motion of celestial bodies, he felt, in the words of one eminent researcher, that he had learned the language in which God created the universe. Today we are learning the language in which God created life. We are gaining ever more awe for the complexity, the beauty, the wonder of God's most divine and sacred gift, said Clinton. Now, as we heard in our reading, the prophet Isaiah says this: "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. And he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace." Isaiah is writing 700 years before Jesus would be born in Bethlehem. And Isaiah also writes about a virgin birth. These are the fingerprints and DNA of the Messiah that was to come, of what it would look like when God came to earth in human form. This is like a map of his DNA. In the Old Testament, there are more than 48 major predictions of Jesus' coming, all made hundreds of years before he did. Isaiah reveals the manner of Jesus' birth, of a virgin. Micah pinpointed the place of his birth, Bethlehem. Genesis and Jeremiah specified his ancestry, a descendant of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, from the tribe of Judah, from the house of David. The Psalms foretold his coming. Psalm 2. His betrayal and manner of death, Psalm 22. And even his eternal resting place in heaven, Psalm 110. Psalm 22, for example, describes his betrayal, his accusation by false witnesses, and his manner of death, pierced by hands and feet. Even though crucifixion wasn't going to be invented for another 600 years when that psalm was written. Yet that very same psalm also predicts his resurrection, just as Psalm 16 does, and the book of Jonah. And then so did Jesus himself. Fingerprints and DNA. Why is such forensic evidence so important? Let me tell you this. The probability of two people having the same fingerprint or DNA is so astronomical that they are considered infallible as evidence for matching somebody's identity. The same is true of these prophecies that apply to Jesus and Jesus alone. I don't know if there's any maths geeks in the room, but for those of you that might like statistics, the likelihood of just 8 of these prophecies being fulfilled in just one person, and bear in mind Jesus fulfilled 48, the probability of just 8 of them being fulfilled in one person is 1 in 100 million billion. I'll tell you what, that'd be like covering the whole of France with 50 pence pieces, 2 feet deep, and marking just a single coin. And then sending me over there blindfolded. And yet somehow I'd stumble around and find that one marked coin. Those are the odds. The mathematician Peter Stoner says that the odds of all 48 prophecies being fulfilled in one person is one chance in a trillion. I'd need to add 7 more trillions. Some people have tried to say, well, what if Jesus formed his life to fit these prophecies, to fulfill them? That could actually apply to a handful of them, yes. But for the majority of them, impossible. And yet, can you imagine somebody that would deliberately get themselves brutally tortured and executed just to fulfill some prophecies? How could he control the place of his birth? Or his ancestry? Or that soldiers would draw lots for his clothes while he was on the cross, and that they wouldn't break his legs on the cross. All of which, and much, much more, was prophesied hundreds of years before in the Old Testament. I could go on. In fact, I will. I mean, just consider the time of his birth. With this, I'll kind of rest my case, so to speak. In the book of Daniel, chapter 9, verses 24 and 25, it says that the Christ, the Messiah, would appear a certain length of time after King Artaxerxes I issued a decree for the Jewish people to go from Persia to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. This puts the anticipated appearance of the Messiah at the exact time in history that Jesus was born and lived. Fingerprints and DNA. Okay, from the year 2000 and a Bill Clinton address to 1969 and a Richard Nixon address. On July 29, 1969, astronaut Neil Armstrong climbed down a ladder, put his feet on the surface of the moon. In his address, President Richard Nixon said this: "The greatest event in human history occurred when man first put his foot on the moon." Another astronaut, Hale Irwin, replied, "The most significant achievement of our age is not that man stood on the moon, but rather that God in Christ stood on the earth." So let me leave you with this challenge. When you look at the baby Jesus and sing the carols, don't just remain aloof. Don't just idly go along with the culture around you that wants you to see a nice tradition, but no more. A vague but baseless story, nice though it is. No, the truth of Christmas, on what it's founded, what it's really all about, is too important just to blindly accept on that vacuous basis year after year. I know that for many of you here, you might well feel like I'm just preaching to the converted. Forgive me for that. But for those of you who are here, who are hearing this stuff, hearing about all this evidence for the first time, why don't you start a journey? Start your journey. I mean, what if it is all true? Is truth or otherwise mean everything? For your life today? For your children's lives? Ultimately, your entire destiny might hinge on all this. So like I did, begin your journey and resolve to investigate this. And you can begin your investigation today by just taking one of these. This is called The Case for Christmas. It's a smaller book from a bigger book, which I first read, and it had a great impression on me as I began my own investigation. You'll find copies of this book on the table as you leave. They're fairly small, as you can see, very easy to read, and they're to the point. If you will read it, then please take one. Okay, After forensic evidence, what's the next best form of evidence? And we kind of covered it before, but I'll tell you, it's credible witnesses. You see, I know you might well be sitting there thinking, well, this all sounds good, Rob, but I just don't find your evidence persuasive enough. You're just not a credible enough witness. I don't even really know you. That's fine, that's fair enough. That's totally understandable. But what would make for a credible witness? How about Dr. Francis Collins? How about that scientist who led the successful search for human DNA? How about him?
Well, in the home where I grew up, faith was not something that was talked about very much. My father was a professor of drama, my mother a playwright. When I went to college and those discussions in the dorm late at night about religion began to occur, I had no particular reason to attach value to a faith system. It had never been something I was familiar with or had internalized at all. And I assumed that any religious feelings that anyone held must be on the basis of some emotional experience, that I didn't trust those, or on the basis of some childhood indoctrination, which I felt I was fortunate to have missed. I loved the experience of learning about the human body and all of the components of that, and I particularly loved being introduced to genetics. But then I ended up in the medical school curriculum sitting at the bedside of patients with diseases. This was no longer an abstract study of molecules and organ systems. These were real people. And one afternoon, one of my patients, a wonderful elderly woman, much like a grandmother, who had very bad heart disease. She had a particularly bad episode of chest pain while I was with her. She got through it. And at the end of that, explained to me how her faith was the thing that helped her in that situation. She realized that the doctors around her weren't really giving her that much help, but her faith was. And after she finished her own very personal description of that faith, she turned to me, and I had been silent. And she looked at me quizzically, and she said, "What do you believe, doctor?" And ultimately, I had to admit to myself that her question had made me realize that I had arrived at an answer to the most important issue that we humans ever deal with. Is there a God? And I had arrived there without ever really looking at the evidence. And I was supposed to be a scientist. If there's one thing scientists claim they do is to arrive at conclusions based upon evidence. And I hadn't taken the trouble to do that. I was greatly assisted by a pastor who lived down the road, who I went and asked about all this, and who gave me a copy of C.S. Lewis's wonderful book, Mere Christianity. Because here was an Oxford scholar, a prodigiously developed intellect, who had traveled the same path. Within those pages, I realized for the first time that one can come to belief on a rational basis, and that in fact, given the many pointers that one sees around oneself in terms of the universe and it having a beginning, and its fine-tuning in terms of the way in which all those constants that determine the behavior of matter and energy seem to have been set just in a certain very precise range to make life possible. And many other things, including my beloved mathematics and why they actually work anyway to describe the universe, something that makes you think the Creator must have been a mathematician. That brought me then to the person of Jesus Christ as a person who was historically extremely well documented. That was news to me. I thought Christ was as much myth as history, and I realized after reading more about it, this was a historical figure upon which we have a great deal of evidence for his existence and his teachings, and even his rising from the dead in a literal way. That day at my patient's bedside started a journey for me. A journey that I was reluctant to begin, but I felt I needed to. A journey that I thought would result in strengthening my atheism, but to my surprise, resulted in my conversion.
One one final thought I want to leave you with. If Francis Collins and I are right, and the fingerprints and DNA of the baby Jesus make him Emmanuel, just as we sang, it means God himself is with us. Then this Christmas, contemplate the motive and the point of his birth and his death and his resurrection. It means, as we sang, death defeated by Emmanuel. It means, through Jesus, death itself could be like moving from one room into another, from a dirty, squalid stable into the banquet hall of a palace. And know that God's motive then for his coming to us in this way is love. He came to us out of love for us all. So have a very Merry Christmas. Amen.